Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Cryptozoology. Today's video is covering a subject, or rather a piece of evidence for a subject, that despite my continued vested interest in it, by all counts really should not exist. Those of you who have followed my channel for a while will know what the Buringer is, but for those who are new and uninitiated into the subject, the Buringer is a cryptid story from Australia, which has some pretty shaky footing, all things considered, in the realm of evidence. Especially considering that the whole idea behind the Buringer, that its identity is in some kind of Tyrannosaurus-like prehistoric surviving dinosaur. Now, there are many cases in the realm of cryptozoology, the study of these supposed animals, which deal with prehistoric survivors, and especially dinosaurs. The Buringer is one of these cases that seems to kind of keep coming up with just little interesting tidbits here and there that lend it, despite many of the drawbacks that it has in credibility, lends it just a little bit of room to still be considered. Now, the identity of what we're considering is, of course, more up for debate. Essentially, what I'm trying to say in not just explaining what the Buringer is, but also in trying to give an idea of how likely the popular theories for the Buringer are, is that, including today's evidence, we don't have any direct evidence of surviving dinosaurs in Australia. However, the footage that I want to discuss today is essentially the closest thing that we have to that, and does suggest that a theropod dinosaur-like animal may be responsible for at least some of these reports, if any are to be believed. Before looking at the footage itself, there's some background to it that should probably be known. This footage was shot in June of 2005 in the Bidyadanga community in Western Australia, right along the coast of the northwest area. Bidyadanga is actually the largest Aboriginal community in Western Australia, although the exact population is a little bit hard to pin down. Some reports say we're looking at around 750 Aboriginal residents, while some census reports report as little as 555. One of the more famous residents of Bidyadanga is a musician called Frankie Shoveller, who is part of the Family Shoveller band. Frankie, in particular, is noted as an Indigenous teacher, musician, and a filmmaker. In terms of the footage, we know that Frankie Shoveller himself did film it, but whether or not he was the uploader is yet to be seen. Unfortunately, attempts to reach out to the Shoveller family and the uploader of the original footage on this subject have not been fruitful. That hasn't slowed interest in the video, though, and a brief summary found in the description of the video on YouTube might tell us why. Entitled Footprints on the Sand, the description of the video remarks, "The footage shows some very strange footprints that were found on a beach near Bidyadanga by some local children who had gone fishing. The footprints are too large to have been made by an emu, and many of the locals believe that they were made by some sort of giant bird that came out of the sea." Before we begin to talk about the theories behind the video, including those proposed by the locals, it would be best to see the video now in its entirety.
No. A dinosaur.
Big eagle or something?
Some sort of bird. But
We think
they wouldn't.
dinosaur.
No.
Walking down the hill.
Apa benda itu kan?
We think it's a secret but yeah, animal miras. You're afraid of it. We saw some strange footprints on the beach. We don't know what it is. Yeah, England, I think down beach side.
As for the tracks themselves, these are definitely bird-like, or you could argue ornithopod or theropod-like tracks, both of those being forms of saurians that eventually gave rise to the birds that we have today, whose digits and overall foot morphology has remained widely similar to their dinosaur ancestors. However, there are some key differences. They are very large tracks, first off, and we don't get a great idea exactly of how big they are. But we do have some key features, those being that from what we can tell in the footage, it appears that there is a sort of almost rectangular-shaped pad to the foot, and the digits, the toes, are roughly all the same length even though they're kind of splayed. This is decidedly not a feature that we see in emu or cassowary footprints, the two flightless birds that would be our best candidates by a long shot for known animals who made these tracks. So, what made them? Unfortunately, we don't know that for sure. But we can get an idea of what the animal might be like. There is a single shot in the footage which I found very interesting, where one of the people observing the tracks happens to place their foot right alongside one of the tracks at a very similar angle relative to the camera's placement. Now, if we assume that this person has the average-sized human male foot, we're looking at a footprint he's leaving behind that is somewhere between 9 and 10 inches, or a 7.5 shoe size. Comparing this to the footprint portrayed next to his, we are looking at a footprint that is about 1 foot in length. And looking at the proportionate size of especially emu, which are the larger flightless birds in Australia, we find that to proportion out the length of the feet to a 6 foot tall person, we're looking at an emu that is close to 8 feet tall, which is rather larger than the known emus today, by a significant margin, especially if this bird is proportioned similar to an emu. Much of its other physical features also become larger and exaggerated. That does not mean that this necessarily has to be a larger emu. Rather, this diagram is helping us get an idea of what this bird, if it is emu-like, would look like. Now, it is also important to note that there are some striking similarities to other animals that these footprints bear. And they are similarities which are one of those kinds of similarities that you may be hesitant to explore because the idea sounds so far-fetched. But it's worth looking at to get an idea of at least what kind of animal might have left these tracks. In other words, we are looking at prehistoric candidates, and what we find is that there is at least one prehistoric candidate which in a rather eerie fashion does match these footprints more than any of Australia's modern wildlife. In a paper authored by Matt White, researchers used what they knew of the foot morphology, or at least the necessary foot morphology, of a fossil species known as Australovenator, which is classified under a group called the Megaraptors, and was Australia's largest raptor-type theropod carnivore, at least that we know of, that we have evidence for. The paper itself was meant to demonstrate how Australovenator suspected foot morphology may explain theropod footprints fossilized at the Lark Quarry region, and in order to do so, use an experimental form of archaeology wherein essentially a model of what the foot of Australovenator likely would have been like, along with its flexibility, the necessary ground types to recreate the prints, etc., and use that to try and recreate these other footprints in order to see how explainable they are via Australovenator's morphology. What is so interesting about these is both the fossilized forms and the experimental forms show us two extremely interesting factors. There's a roughly rectangular shape to the pad of the foot, and the digits, with, of course, some room for exception, are very, very close to being equal in length when they strike the ground. Much like the tracks found in Bidyadanga in the summer of 2005. Does this mean that a surviving Australovenator made these tracks? No, not necessarily. It is really interesting and, frankly, hard to ignore that the Bidyadanga footprints resemble these more than they resemble tracks of known modern theropod-like species. At the very least, it suggests perhaps a more archaic form of theropod-like foot morphology, and, of course, to the extreme, may represent an unknown species of theropod descendant, or, a little bit further into the extreme and into the realm of the Buringer, a surviving true theropod. Of course, knowing exactly what answer to go with is impossible right now, and Occam's razor would tell us that in all likelihood, this is at the very least a modern flightless bird of some sort that either grew very large, or is a subspecies or new species that is just exceedingly rare and has a more archaic form of its theropod-like foot morphology. Taking into consideration the stories that we find here and there of sightings of what people describe as true theropod dinosaurs, it does make one think twice about what the significance of these tracks may be. Now, the tracks in Bidyadanga have garnered some attention from people who research dinosaur cryptids, including William Gibbons, but again, all attempts to talk to either the uploader or the filmmaker, if they're not the same person, and even the Frankie Shoveller band on the subject, have been in vain. At least, so far. Who knows the future holds on that? Hopefully, we can ask informed people questions about this and maybe begin to find some details that we weren't aware of before, and explanations for at least some of the many questions that this particular footage raises about Australian wildlife and the Buringer. I'd like to thank everyone for watching this video. It's one of the last videos that I want to make in the format that I currently present my videos in. But that is neither here nor there. It's just an opportunity maybe to reach out and say thank you to everyone who continues to watch my videos, and I hope that I gave this subject some real due diligence in presenting it to all of you. And if any of you happen to have any information on these, by some miracle, we'd all love to hear. That being said, until next time.